Almost immediately after the end of the First Russo-Turkish War under Catherine the Great, the Treaty of Küçükçayırcı was violated. The Ottomans stopped paying money contributions and blocked Russian merchant ships from passing through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. Taking advantage of the instability in the Crimean Khanate, Russia invades and put its puppet in power there. The Ottoman Empire did not recognize this. In the summer of 1778, her fleet arrived on the shores of Crimea, threatening to land troops. But the vigilance of Suvorov, who commanded the defense, caused the enemy to abandon its plans. After the uprising in the Khanate, Catherine decided to act. Crimea's independence was too costly for Russia. In 1783, Crimea was annexed. After some hesitation, the Ottomans were forced to recognize this. In case of a new war with Ottomans, Russia needed the support or neutrality of Austria, which had its own interests in Balkans. Emperor Joseph agreed to an alliance with Catherine, not wanting her to get closer to Prussia. The Russian Empress decided to show her strength to the Ottomans. In July 1787, Catherine made a luxurious trip to Novorossiya, which had been developed by her favorite, Grigory Potemkin. Emperor Joseph accompanied the Empress incognito. Many in the Ottoman Empire perceived this as a challenge and an insult. The alliance between Austria and Russia caused concern in Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire began to prepare for a struggle. Russia, Britain and Sweden encouraged her in these actions. After presenting the Russians with an impossible ultimatum, Ottoman Empire declared war in August. The Ottomans also accused the Russians of interfering in affairs of Moldavia and Georgia. But neither side was ready for war yet. Preparations were not complete. Autumn was approaching, and the first campaign could not be decisive. On paper, Russian forces included the Yekaterineslav army, 80,000 men, under the command of Potemkin. The Ukrainian army, 30,000 men, under the command of Rumyantsev. And the Caucasian Corps, 20,000 men. Part of the Black Sea Fleet was stationed in the newly built Sevastopol. The rest of the ships were near Kherson. The Ukrainian army guarded the western borders and defended Poland from Turkish invasion. The Yekaterineslav army was preparing to advance through the powerful enemy stronghold of Ochakov to join forces with its Austrian allies. An Ottoman army of 60,000 men gathered near Adrianople. The rest of the troops were preparing to land on Russian soil. The Russian troops were weakened and suffered from a lack of food. There were no pontoons or siege equipment. To successfully attack the Balkans, it was necessary to take Ochakov, a Turkish stronghold on the Russian border. But the Russians were not ready and postponed the campaign until the following year. Meanwhile, Austria, loyal to her alliance with Catherine, was also making military preparations. In the previous year, 1786, Alexander Vasilievich Suvorov was promoted to full general. Now the troops of the 57-year-old man were supposed to guard Kinburn. This area served as a barrier protecting Crimea from enemy attacks through Petrov. This fortress also prevented the enemy fleet from approaching Russian ships in Kherson. But the commander-in-chief of Yekaterineslav army, Potemkin, to whom Catherine wrote, was in depressed mood. Recently, the Black Sea Fleet, his newly born legacy, had been severely battered by a storm and the Turks. To lift Potemkin out of his despondency and force him to act, something spectacular was needed, a victory that was already on its way. The Ottomans attempted to attack Kinburn in August, but failed. Suvorov tirelessly engaged in military preparations, traveling back and forth between Kherson and Kinburn. He gave instructions, observed the Ottoman fleet and built fortifications. Major General von Reck was entrusted with the defense of the fortress. On September 28 and 26, the Ottomans attempted to land near Kinburn, but were repelled again. The enemy force bombarded the fort relentlessly. The defenders fired back and managed to blow up one battleship. A Russian galley under the command of Lieutenant Lombard arrived as reinforcements, acted very boldly and inflicted heavy damage on the Ottomans. Suvorov foresaw the enemy landing. He arrived in Kinburn. He gathered all available forces closer to the fortress. In front of the fortress was a long, narrow strip of land. The fortress itself was rather weak, but at least the narrowness of the battlefield would not allow the enemy of their numerical superiority. The Russians built several batteries in front of Kinburn. On October 11th, the bombardment of Kinburn intensified. Under this covering fire, the Ottomans landed on the tip of the spit early in the morning, October 11th. At the time, Suvorov was in church with his officers for a holiday celebration. A small force attempted to land east of the fortress. This was a diversionary tactic. The Turks were driven back into the sea by the Cossacks' attack. On the spit, the Turks began to build trenches laid out in lines. They were assisted by French engineers presented in the army. Most of the Ottoman army consisted of Janissaries, its best warriors. Suvorov allowed the enemy to land unhindered in order to then crush them with a single blow. Ottoman ships quickly sailed back and forth landing soldiers. Soon, about 5,000 Janissaries gathered at the tip. They were opposed by only 1,500 infantry and a small number of cavalry. Reinforcements that arrived later would bring Suvorov's army to about 4,000 men. But for now, the Russians were outnumbered and preparing to repel the attack. Preparing to repel the enemy's attack, Suvorov lined up his infantry in two lines. The formation was deployed. There was no need for a square because the Turks had no cavalry. The Cossacks' regiment were positioned behind the flanks. The supply convoy was placed behind the fortress. There were 3 trenches on the Russian side. The Ottomans advanced slowly, building one trench after another. When they approached within range of grape shot at 3 p.m., the Russian cannons opened fire. This was the signal to attack. Major General von Reck and its first line of infantry charged with bayonets. The Cossacks provided support on the flanks. Gradually, the Russians captured 10 trenches. The Janissaries defended fiercely. The second line of infantry joined the battle. At this time, the Ottoman fleet arrived and opened heavy fire on the Russians. 600 cannons tore through the tight ranks. Russian losses grew. Reck himself was seriously wounded. The soldiers temporarily lost their high command. The Ottomans were receiving reinforcements, taking advantage of the situation. The Janissaries launched a counterattack and captured several cannons. Suvorov was now forced to use his reserves to stabilize the situation. The commander-in-chief was at the forefront of his army. Suddenly, his horse was killed beneath him, but he remained at command. The Russians pushed back the Ottomans slightly, capturing several trenches. Meanwhile, at sea, Lombard engaged the enemy. Some Ottoman ships were forced to move away from the shore, but the remaining cannons continued to fire. During this artillery duel, Russian guns in and around the fortress were able to sink several enemy ships. The battle continues with varying success. Troops are confused in chaos. Ottoman fleet sometimes stops firing, not knowing where the enemy is. Suvorov was wounded in the side by a grape shot, but gradually the Janissaries managed to drive the Russians out of all the trenches. The army retreated to the fortress. It was beginning to get dark. At that moment, Russian reinforcements finally arrived. Without wasting any time, they rushed straight into battle. The entire army was on the move and advancing. The Janissaries fought bravely, but the Russians' way was unstoppable. At that moment, Suvorov was wounded a second time by a bullet in his left arm. The bullet went right through him. The loss of blood weakened him, and he briefly lost consciousness. The Cossacks immediately bandaged him up. As night fell, the last reinforcements arrived to the Russians. This was the final nail in the coffin. The Ottomans were pushed back to the very end of the spit. Panic spread. The Ottomans, looking for escape, threw into the sea. Many drowned. Only a few managed to reach Ochakov. The Russian cavalry completed the total defeat of the enemy and returned the captured cannons. The Russians lost about 440 men killed and wounded. The Ottomans' losses were about 4,500 men. The Russians captured 14 enemy banners. For a long time after, the waves swept the Turks' corpses ashore near Ochakov. In October, the Russian fleet attempted to challenge the Ottomans once more near Ochakov. The attack failed, but the earlier defeat at Kinburn had already shaken Ottoman confidence. Their ships soon withdrew to Varna, leaving the northern Black Sea exposed. In Constantinople, the atmosphere was uncertain. The loss at Kinburn had undermined morale and raised doubts about the empire's strength. In St. Petersburg, however, the mood was entirely different. The victory was hailed as a triumph, and Suvorov's name was celebrated across Russia. Despite being seriously wounded in the fighting, he was eventually awarded the empire's highest order. Through the long winter that followed, the Russian army made camp along the steppe. Suvorov, still recovering, worked tirelessly to reinforce Kinburn's defenses. Determined to secure the fortress against renewed attacks, his preparations ensured that this remote outpost would remain in Russian hands. The victory at Kinburn boosted the morale of the Russian army and secured Russia's position on the Black Sea, and gave it the initiative at the start of a conflict that would soon spread across the region. The Russo-Turkish War is in full flame. Last year, the Russians managed to capture the important stronghold of Ochakov. This victory allowed them to continue their advance deep into the Balkans. But the outbreak of the Russo-Swedish War diverted part of the Russian forces from operation in south of the country. The Austrians were preparing to cross the Danube and capture Belgrade. Rumyantsev was removed from command of the Ukrainian army. Potemkin became commander-in-chief of all Russian forces. The Russians crossed the Dniester and entered Kishinev and Yashin. The Ottoman commander Yusuf Pasha, sitting in Mashin, tried to drive the enemy's advanced units out of the relied. The attack ended in failure. Russian troops under der Felden launched a counter-offensive, won several skirmishes and took Galatz. Kamensky, the new commander of the Ukrainian army, ordered the city to be burned. The Russians returned to Belgrade. On the Dniester, the Turks had the fortresses of Benderi and Akirman. Potemkin's army was to take control of this river line. Meanwhile, Sultan Abdul Hamid died. He was replaced by the more energetic Selim III. He wanted to regain the lost lands. Both armies spent May and June in inactivity. Potemkin was in no hurry to attack. He feared enemy landings at Ochakov and at Crimea. Another change in command slowed down the Russians' preparations. Kamensky was replaced by Repnin. His troops covered the slow movement of Yekaterinoslav army from Olivopol to Dniester. Russian supplies suffered due to flooding of the Dniester. Der Felden's division, 10,000 men, stationed at Belgrade, was transferred to Suvorov. Alexander had to maintain contact with Prince Kurburg's Austrian corps and watch over the territory between the Prut and Seret rivers. Potemkin left Olivopol only in mid-July. At the same time, the Ottoman army under the command of Yusuf Pasha, 30,000 men strong, moved towards Foshchani. Its target is Prince Kurburg with 18,000 men. Repnin ordered Suvorov to come to the rescue. Leaving part of his troops to guard the baggage train, Suvorov set out immediately. The march was fast, covering 50 miles in 36 hours. Now it was necessary to reach an agreement and further actions between the two commanders. Coburg wanted to meet with the Russian general in person, but Suvorov declined. Coburg had been promoted to full general earlier and had the right to leadership, but Alexander didn't want to give it up. Suvorov sent his Austrian colleague a plan for the upcoming battle. There was no time to argue. Coburg agreed. On August 1st, the combined Allied army, 25,000 men, met the enemy at Foshchani. The Ottomans were defeated. The Allies lost 350 men, the Ottomans' casualties 1,600. The victors captured 12 cannons and 16 banners. The remnant of the army fled to Brailo and Bucharest. The two Allied generals finally met on the battlefield and congratulated each other on the victory. Coburg respected Suvorov and recognized his leadership. The Austrians and Russians returned to their previous positions. Suvorov argued for an offensive, but it was not up to him to decide. Everyone was waiting for Potemkin. On August 20, the vanguard of Potemkin's army was near Kishinev, and the main forces entered Dubusari the next day. Repnin's army was between Yashi and Belgrade. The Grand Vizier was eager to avenge the defeat at Foshchani and planned an offensive in Moldavia to drive the Allies out of there. To distract Potemkin's army, he ordered Hasan Pasha to march northwest from Izmail with 30,000 men. This maneuver would also cut off Suvorov's retreat. Potemkin ordered Repnin to march against Hasan. On September 18, Repnin won a series of skirmishes. Hassan did not dare to continue the fight and retreated back to Izmail. Rymnik, taking into account the weakness of the enemy following their defeat, attempted to capture the fortress. However, it quickly became clear that Izmail was far too strong. The bombardment proved pointless and Rymnik retreated. The vizier arrived in Brailu. His huge army, numbering between 90,000 men and 100,000 men with 80 guns, began its march towards Rymnik. Suvorov suspected that the Ottomans' main attack would again be aimed at Austrians. He moved his 7,000 men towards Putseni. The Russians were ready to join forces with Coburg at any moment. Finally, Coburg's letter for help arrived. After a short hesitation, the troops moved out. The rivers were flooded. The march was exhausting and swift, in Suvorov's style. On the morning of September 21st, Suvorov joined forces with Coburg near Forchani. The total number of allies was 25,000 men and 73 cannons. Coburg was concerned about the enemy's significant superiority, 4-1. The discussion continued. Finally, after Suvorov threatened that the Russians would launch the offensive on their own, Coburg agreed to attack together. Suvorov personally went on reconnaissance to the Rymnik river. The Ottoman army was camped on this river in 4 camps. The distance between the first and fourth camp was 8 miles. Meanwhile, the vizier had been standing still for several days, waiting for news from east. A large number of supply trains significantly hampered army's maneuverability. The terrain was marked by forests, ravines and cornfields. On September 22, before sunrise, the Allies quietly approached the Rymnik river. It was shallow, so the troops crossed it on foot. Everything was done in an orderly and secretive manner, hidden from the enemy. The Russians were closer to the enemy vanguard near the village of Tirgokokoli. Suvorov lined up the infantry in 2 lines of squares. The Cossacks, Carabineers and Austrian Hussars lined up behind them in 2 more lines. The Austrians lined up with their back to the river in 9 squares, arranged in 2 lines. Major General Karachkai with the 10th square and Hussars was in the gap between Coburg's and Suvorov. Suvorov had to execute a wide flanking maneuver. First, he had to take the first camp, then move to the flank of the second. Coburg was expected to hold the enemy's large forces, while the Russians carried out their task. A general attack by the Allies on the second camp was planned. The weather was clear. Suvorov wasted no time and began advancing on the first camp along the Rymnik river. The Ottoman forces were positioned on high ground here. The Russians' path lay through cornfields and thick, tall weeds, which slowed their advance. Soon, skirmishes with Turkish patrol began. At the Russians' approach, enemy artillery opened fire. Russian guns responded in kind. Suddenly, a deep ravine appeared in front of the fortifications, with only one narrow road crossing it. The infantry hesitated, but Suvorov gave them no time to think. The right-flanked square boldly crossed the ravine and attacked the Ottoman battery with bayonets. This causes part of the enemy forces to flee south. The Ottomans surround this square for a short time, but more and more Russian forces joined the battle. Suvorov was in the middle square of the first line. Meanwhile, the Cossacks and Austrian Hussars broke into the camp from the rear. The enemy's morale is broken, and now all the Turks are fleeing south. Suvorov stops the Cossacks from pursuing the enemy. The battle was just beginning. Meanwhile, Coburg advanced on the second camp. He is met by the large Ottoman cavalry. They surrounded the Austrians from the front and flanks. The Austrians fight bravely and hold their ground. The vizier was suffering from a fever, but he still commands from the second camp. He noticed a large gap between the allies and decided to cut them off. The Ottomans from the Bogza village attacked Karachai's square. The charge was so strong that the Austrians barely maintained their positions. Suvorov sent 2 battalions to Karachai's aid. After a fierce fighting, the Turks were repelled. The Ottomans attempted to attack Suvorov's left flank. The center square moved to put the enemy under crossfire. The cavalry arrived in time to repel the enemy. The Ottomans retreated and joined forces with those falling back after the assault on Karachai. Together they rushed at the Russians. They were met with devastating fire and an attack by Karachai on the right flank. The exhausted Turks began to retreat to Bogza. In despair, the enemy cavalry again charged the Austrian left flank. It was without result. The Russians bypassed the Kayata forest before attacking the second camp. Suvorov gave his troops half an hour to rest. The battle order of the troops, which had been battered after the battle, was restored. Both sides were silent and preparing for the final clash. The next target is Bogza. Here and ahead of the Krigumailor forest, the Turks have built several batteries. In addition, they built trenches in front of the forest, but didn't have time to finish them. Still, the position was strong. So far, the Allied army had only faced the enemy's cavalry, while the infantry defended the second camp. At 1 p.m. the Allied troops set off. The Grand Vizier assembled a powerful force in front of the forest. A huge wave rushed at Coburg. The greatest pressure was on the Austrian left flank. The squares repelled one enemy attack after another. The Hussars broke into the Turks' dense masses, where they repelled and attacked again. The Austrians could not hold back this offensive for long. Coburg sent several officers to Suvorov with a request for help, but Alexander did not change his plan. The Russian squares, stubbornly advancing, pushed back the Turkish cavalry and take Bogza. The Turkish cannons were taken to the rear. The Ottomans, noticing Suvorov's movement, hesitated and stopped their attacks on the Austrians. They began to retreat slowly. The Vizier's army suffered fierce crossfire from the Allies. The squares of the first Russian line spread out, and part of the cavalry moved in. The rest of the horses remained on the flanks, and some were kept in reserve. The Allies advanced. Finally, they formed a single concave line. The Ottomans held their fortifications. Suvorov decided to storm them and deliver the final blow. He asked Coburg to assist in the attack. Soon, the Allies' fire made the enemy cannons fall silent. Suvorov sent all the cavalry forward. The infantry follows the horses at a rapid pace. Cossacks, Carabineers and Hussars quickly overcome the unfinished fortifications and break into the camp. The Turks defend themselves desperately, but the pressure of the Allies is too strong. The Ottomans' morale breaks. The Allies' cavalry chased the fleeing enemy into the forest. The infantry came up and joined into the slaughter. The Grand Vizier tried to stop the fleeing crowds, even ordering the cannons to fire several shots at them. but it was impossible to stop the fleeing army. The Ottomans lost the will to fight. In the chaos, some of the enemy's ammunition exploded. At 4 p.m., the fate of the battle was decided. Some Allied soldiers cleared the forest of enemies. The Turks left their largest camp near Martineshti and attempted to cross the other side of the river. Thousands of people, horses, and carts filled the water. Many drowned. The Allies' sabers ended the Ottomans' suffering. The Allied army was exhausted and had no strength left to pursue. But Suvorov was satisfied with what they achieved. The Allies celebrated their victory. The next day, they captured the last fort camp and killed several hundred wandering Turks. The Allies captured a huge enemy convoy, 100 banners and 80 cannons. The Ottomans lost 15 to 20,000 men. An unknown number fled later. The Russians lost 170 men, while Austrians lost 450. For this great victory, Suvorov was awarded with the title Count of Rymnik. Catherine gave him the empire's highest military award, the Order of St. George, first class. Joseph ennobled Suvorov as Count of the Holy Roman Empire. Coburg became a field marshal. The Grand Vizier took refuge in Brailov and tried to gather what remained of his army. A few weeks later, he died of illness. After Rymnik, a further advance into the Balkans across the Danube seemed natural, but Potemkin was not as decisive a commander as Suvorov. The Russians returned to Birlad. The defeat of the Vizier's army forced the Ottoman fortresses on the Dniester River to surrender, including the stronghold of Benderi. Coburg approached Bucharest and took it without a fight. The Austrians also occupied Belgrade. This marked the end of the 1789 campaign. At the beginning of 1790, Russia was in difficult position. Its ally successes in previous year had alarmed some European powers. Prussia was the most active, attempting to form an alliance with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. Austrian Emperor Joseph died. The new Emperor Leopold took part in international negotiations on the war's outcome. Under these circumstances, Russia wasn't ready to keep pushing forward. The defense of the conquered territories began. The fighting spirit of the Ottomans was undermined. The Vizier even negotiated with Potemkin, but nothing came of it. At sea, Admiral Ushakov's Russian fleet left Sevastopol and defeated the Turkish ships in the Battle of the Kerch Strait. But on land, Russia lost her ally. Under the Treaty of Reichenbach, Austria ceased hostilities against Ottoman Empire. However, in the north, Russia made peace with Sweden. This freed up some Russian forces for the war in the south. The Ottomans actively strengthened their fortresses, Brailov, Silistria and especially Izmail. This defensive line on the Danube was very strong. The Ribas's fleet was intended to assist the Russian troops in capturing these fortresses. It made a long journey from Ochakov along the Black Sea coast and sailed up the Danube. The joint actions of army and fleet ensured the successful capture of the fortresses of Tulcea and Kilia. On November 29th, the Russian fleet arrived near Izmail. The Turkish fleet did not dare to stop the enemy at the fortress's walls. There was an island, Salin, opposite the fortress. Long batteries began to be laid there. The Ottomans tried to interfere and opened fire, but the Russian ships soon silenced the enemy's cannons. The next day, the Russians attacked the enemy fleet and destroyed it. Soon, Russian troops began to actively converge on Izmail. However, the Russian High Command became deeply skeptical about the possibilities of capturing such a strong fortress. Russian troops were experiencing serious supply problems, and army morale was low. Frost set in. Some of the siege guns were even sent back to Benderi. Potemkin debated whether to lift the siege or not. Meanwhile, Suvorov, being in Galatz, received an order to take command of the troops near Izmail. Without wasting any time, he set off, taking a handful of his soldiers with him. On December 13th, Suvorov arrived at the walls of the fortress. Potemkin did not dare to make a final decision. He gave Alexander only permission to lift the siege. But Suvorov was eager to take this fortress, which some considered impregnable. The Ottoman garrison numbered 35,000 men, 17,000 of whom were janissaries. The artillery was very powerful. They had plenty of ammunition and food. The Russian troops suffered from a shortage of siege artillery. Suvorov had a total of about 31,000 men, including large numbers of Cossacks, who were not particularly useful for capturing fortresses. Izmail was located on high ground, ending in a steep slope at the Danube. The fortress had been strengthened by French engineers. Suvorov, accompanied by his generals, conducted daily reconnaissance. He showed them the routes the columns would take during the assault, and the targets they needed to capture. Ladders were prepared. Batteries were set up to the east and west. Suvorov demanded that Mehmet Pasha, the commander of the garrison, to surrender. He politely but firmly refused and asked for a 10-day truce. Suvorov, of course, did not accept this. On December 20, a military council was convened. Suvorov was able to convince the generals that upcoming assault would be successful. With his impassioned speech, everyone in Russian camp was filled with enthusiasm. The soldiers continued to train. Izmail was divided by a low land into the old and new fortresses. The Russian troops were divided into 3 parts and a reserve. The first part, under the overall command of General Pavel Potemkin, 7,500 men, formed 3 columns to capture the old fortress. Lvov's first column was to move along the shore. The second column, led by Lacy, was to take the Brodsky's Gate. The third column, led by Mekhnov, was to attack from the north, where the moat was deepest. The second part was under overall command of Samoilov, with 12,000 men. Its task was to capture the new fortress and one of the bastions of Old One. Orlov's 4th column and Platov's 5th column were to move between the Benders and Kilias gates. The 6th column was entrusted to the rising star of the Russian army, Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov. He was to storm the Kilias gate. Finally, the third part of the troops, 9,000 men, was to operate from the Danube under the overall command of Deribas. Arseniev's right column was intended to attack the new fortress. Chepega's middle column was in the center. Markov's left column was preparing to storm the old fortress. The Russians had in total 540 cannons, 40 on land, 100 on the island, and 400 on ships. The Ottoman artillery was half that size, around 250 cannons. On December 21st, the day before the assault, a long firefight began that lasted the entire day. Finally, at 3 AM on December 22nd, fog hung in the air. The columns moved smoothly, throwing fascines into the moats, descending into them, and placing ladders against the ramparts. In some places, the height of the ramparts made it necessary to tie the ladders together. The light infantry at the head of the columns was scattered along the fortifications, covering their comrades. The second column engaged in hand-to-hand combat first. A fierce battle with cold weapons broke out. The attack stalled, but other columns were already rushing to join the fight. The first column crossed a wide moat and a series of palisades behind it, and attacked the Turks. General Lvov was seriously wounded, but the attack continued. The third column was forced to overcome even bigger obstacles to finally meet the Janissaries, led by Mehmed Pasha himself. During the desperate battle, Mekhnov was wounded, but the Russians captured the bastion. Advancing step by step, the second and third columns joined forces. In the east, the sixth column climbs the fortifications under a hail of grape shot and bullets. Kutuzov, like other column commanders, leads the way. Meanwhile, the fifth and fourth columns are forced to advance across a deep moat filled with water. They climb ladders to the walls. But the Ottomans decide to make a raid through the Bender's Gate on the Russian flank. A confused battle ensued, with troops from both sides mixing in chaos. Seeing the difficult situation in this sector, Suvorov sent the cavalry, which had been held in reserve, as reinforcements. Kutuzov also sent one battalion. The Ottoman attack was repelled. The Russians climbed the ladders again. Orlovs took the bastion at the Bender Gate. But the sixth column still met with stubborn resistance from the Ottomans, and the morale of the soldiers here began to fall. Suvorov decided to encourage Kutuzov by informing him of his appointment as commander of Izmail. The commander gathered his forces and attacked again. Finally, the Russians took the bastion. The 6th and 5th columns joined forces. The Cossacks from the 5th column rushed towards the shore, helping the attacks from the south. The Turkish artillery tried to stop the enemy from landing, but because of the darkness and fog, they couldn't inflict much damage on the Russian ships. As soon as they got close enough, the second line of fleet split up and took up position on the flanks of the first line, whose ships were filled with soldiers. Just like in other parts of the fortress, a stubborn battle raged here. The Turks deserve credit for their bravery that night, which was no less than that of the Russians. Markov was wounded, but the soldiers, despite the loss of many generals and officers, continued to press the enemy. Dawn breaks. The Russians have won at all points. The Ottomans, having lost all their fortifications, retreat deep into the city. They fight to the end. Suvorov gave his troops a little time to rest. Then the final assault begins. Russian troops advance from all sides. The Ottomans met the Russians in narrow streets, shooting at them from houses. Most stubbornly, the Turks resisted in tough stone buildings, numerous in Izmail. Step by step, Suvorov's army advanced. Some Ottomans were killed, some were taken prisoner. In one occurrence, one of the Turks who had already surrendered wounded a Russian officer. The enraged soldiers killed him and his comrades. To speed up the process of suppressing the remaining resistance, Suvorov ordered the use of 20 cannons. The defenders were hit with grape shot. Some houses were on fire. The civilian population also took part in the defense of Izmail, arming themselves with whatever they could find. After all the horrors of the assault and such stubborn resistance from the Turks, Russian soldiers carried out unnecessary massacres here and there. The battle inside the city had already lasted 6 hours. Finally, the last remnants of the garrison laid down their arms. In total, the assault lasted 12 hours. After that, the city was given to the soldiers for 3 days, as was the custom at the time. Kutuzov became commandant of Izmail. The Ottomans lost about 26,000 men killed, and some of the prisoners later died from their wounds. This number also includes civilians. The victors captured 200 cannons and more than 300 banners, along with large supplies of ammunition and food. Officially, Russian losses numbered 4,600 killed and wounded. In reality, they could well have reached 10,000. Among them were 400 officers, out of 650 before the assault. The capture of Izmail was one of Suvorov's greatest achievements. The song Thunder of Victory Resound was dedicated to this triumph and became Russia's unofficial national anthem for several decades. Suvorov could have been promoted to field marshal, but his complicated relations with Potemkin at the time prevented this. Alexander had to wait 4 more years for this rank. After Izmail, the war was effectively decided. The Ottoman Danube line had collapsed, and the empire no longer possessed the strength to recover. Russian pressure continued through next year, while diplomacy replaced battle as the Ottomans sought to limit further losses. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Yashi. The Ottomans formally accepted the loss of Crimea, recognizing it as Russian territory. Russia gained the northern Black Sea coast, with the Dniester set as its new frontier. For the Ottoman Empire, Izmail marked another step in a long decline. Its fortresses could be taken, its armies defeated, and its strategic initiative lost. The balance of power in Eastern Europe had shifted. For Russia, the capture of Izmail marked its arrival as a major European power. Its army and navy had proven themselves, and the Black Sea had become a Russian sea.